The heat in the Arizona Territory in the year 1887 did not just sit on the skin, it burrowed into the bone. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that smelled of sulfur, dry sage, and the relentless, powdery red dust that defined the town of Red Creek. Lila Garner sat by the window of the overland stagecoach, bracing herself as the vehicle lurched over a deep rut in the hard-packed earth. She was 26 years old, though the reflection she caught in the dusty glass often looked older. Widowhood had a way of aging a woman faster than the sun, stripping away the softness of girlhood and leaving behind something harder, more durable, like cured leather. She adjusted her gloves, her fingers tracing the sharp crease of the letter tucked into her reticule. "Come to Red Creek," the letter had said, written in Sadie Cale's distinctive, looping scrawl. "The mines are spitting silver, and the town is growing so fast they cannot keep count. I have spoken to the bank manager and the owner of the boarding house. There is work for a woman with your head for numbers. We can start over. Lila, just you and me, like the old days." Lila took a shallow breath, trying to filter out the dust. She was not a woman prone to flights of fancy. She was a telegraph operator and a bookkeeper, a woman of ledgers and Morse code. She believed in the tangible, a column of figures that balanced at the bottom of a page, the click-clack of a message sent and received, the honest ache of a back after a 12-hour shift. She believed that if she worked hard enough, life would eventually grant her a quiet, decent corner to exist in. She had left her previous life in a town 3 days east because the memories of her late husband were too thick there, and the opportunities for a single woman were too thin. Sadie was her only tether left in this world. They had starved together in a cold winter 5 years ago, sharing thin soup and thinner blankets. That kind of bond did not break easily. The stagecoach drivers shouted at the horses, and Red Creek came into view. It was a scar on the landscape, a cluster of wooden buildings bleached gray by the sun, clinging to the edge of a canyon. The creek that gave the town its name was currently a cruel joke. The drought had reduced it to a trickle of brown sludge. In this territory, water was not just a resource, it was liquid gold, more valuable than the silver ore the men dragged from the bowels of the earth. As the coach slowed, Lila saw the town clearly. There was a church with a peeling white steeple, a row of saloons that looked far more prosperous than the general store, and people moving sluggishly through the heat. But what caught her eye was the color. Everything was coated in that red dust. It settled on the brims of hats, on the backs of horses, and on the wooden boardwalks. It looked like the town was rusting. High above the main street, on the second-floor balcony of the largest building in town, the Crow Land and Cattle Office, Silas Crow, watched the stagecoach arrive. He was a man of substantial girth, dressed in a suit that cost more than most miners earned in 3 years. He held a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling as he swirled his wrist. He did not drink water if he could help it. Water was for selling, not consuming. "Is that the one?" Crow asked, his voice a low rumble. Sheriff Ephraim Dodd stood behind him, nervously twisting his hat in his hands. Dodd was a man who played the part of the law well enough for strangers, with a shiny badge and a practiced scowl. But his spine had been bought and paid for by Crow years ago. "That is her, Mr. Crow," Dodd replied. "Sadie says she can work a telegraph key and balance a double-entry ledger. Says she is smart." Crow took a sip of his whiskey. "Smart is fine. Sheriff, smart is useful, as long as she is not too smart. The railroad representatives will be here in 2 months. By then, I need every deed to the water rights in this valley signed over to me. I need the people desperate, and I need them poor. If this newcomer helps us manage the paperwork at the bank, good. If she asks questions..." Crow let the sentence hang in the hot air. "Sadie will keep her in line," Dodd said quickly. "Sadie knows the score." "See that she does," Crow said, turning his back on the window. "This drought is a blessing. Ephraim, it makes men weak, and when men are weak, they sell cheap." Down on the street, the stagecoach door swung open. Lila stepped down. her boots sinking an inch into the red dirt. The noise of the town washed over her, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the shouting of a vendor selling tepid lemonade, the low murmur of men gathered on the porch of the Lucky Nugget Saloon. "Lila! Oh, Lila!" The shriek cut through the ambient noise. Sadie Cale came rushing from the boardwalk, her skirts kicking up clouds of dust. Sadie was 25, blonde and pretty, in a sharp, hungry sort of way. She wore a dress that was perhaps a shade too bright and a cut too low for a respectable afternoon. But her smile was blinding. Before Lila could even steady her luggage, Sadie threw her arms around her, squeezing with a force that felt bordering on desperate. "You came. I told everyone you would come." Sadie pulled back, holding Lila by the shoulders, her eyes scanning Lila's face with an intensity that made Lila blink. "Look at you. You look tired. Darling, but we will fix that. We will fix everything." "Hello, Sadie," Lila said, managing a smile. She felt stiff in Sadie's grip. "It is good to see you. The journey was long." Sadie turned to the crowd that had gathered to watch the arrival of the coach. She kept her arm looped possessively through Lila's, pulling her close, presenting her like a prize at a county fair. "This is my dearest friend," Sadie announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying down the street. "The smartest woman I know. She is going to help turn this town around. You just wait and see." Lila felt the weight of the stairs. Men with kohl-rimmed eyes looked her up and down. Women in faded calico dresses whispered behind their hands, their eyes narrowing. It was not a welcoming scrutiny. It felt predatory. They were measuring her, calculating her worth, wondering what she had brought and what she could have taken from them. "Sadie," Lila whispered, trying to loosen her friend's grip. "Let us just get my trunk. I need to wash the dust off." Of course, Sadie beamed, but she did not let go. "I have a room ready for you at the boarding house. It is small, but it is ours, and I spoke to Mr. Henderson at the bank. He is expecting you tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp." Lila nodded, grateful for the prospect of work. "Thank you, Sadie. You do not know how much this means to me." "Oh, I know," Sadie said, her smile flickering for a brief second, looking almost brittle. "We all need a place to belong. Lila, Red Creek is going to be our home. I have made sure of it." As they walked toward the hotel, a man bumped into Lila. He was tall, smelling of stale beer. He didn't apologize, just leered. Lila stiffened, clutching her bag tighter. She looked around, hoping to see a lawman, and saw Sheriff Dodd standing on the corner. He was watching, but he made no move to intervene. He just chewed on a toothpick, his eyes sliding over her with indifferent amusement. Lila looked past the buildings, toward the edge of town where the civilization of Red Creek crumbled into the wild emptiness of the desert. The horizon was vast and broken by jagged mesas. It was beautiful, but it was a harsh, unforgiving beauty. She saw a coil of rope hanging from a hitching post, swaying slightly in the hot wind. It looked innocuous, yet strangely ominous against the red backdrop, miles away from the noise of the town, in the silence of the canyonlands where the shadows stretched long and purple. The man called Nantan, known to the few white men who had met him, and lived as Kai crouched on a limestone ridge. Kai was Apache. He was perhaps 30 years old, though the sun and the wind had etched lines around his eyes that spoke of many lifetimes. He wore buckskin breeches and a faded calico shirt, blending perfectly with the stone and scrub brush. He was still, so still, that a lizard skittered over his boot without pausing. His attention was fixed on the valley floor below. He was not looking at the town of Red Creek, though he knew it was there, a festering wound on the land that drank more water than the earth could provide. He was tracking a group of 6 men riding north. They were dressed as hunters, wearing rough-spun coats and wide-brimmed hats, carrying rifles slung casually over their saddles. To an untrained eye, they were nothing more than drifters looking for game or acclaim. But Kai did not look with an untrained eye. He looked with the steady gaze of a man who had spent his life reading the language of the ground. He raised a brass spyglass. a relic from a past skirmish, and focused on the riders. They rode in a formation, 2 by 2, maintaining a disciplined distance. They sat high in their saddles, their posture rigid, not slouching like weary hunters. Their horses were well fed, their shoes new. And the rifles, they were not hunting rifles. They were repeating Winchesters, clean and oiled. Soldiers, Kai whispered in his own tongue, the word barely a breath. Or men who fight for money. He lowered the glass. These men were heading toward the pass that led to the secret springs, the few remaining water sources his people relied on. And, incidentally, the perfect ambush point for the silver shipment scheduled for the next day. Kai's face remained impassive, his expression as unreadable as the mountain face. He did not hate the white men with the fiery passion of his youth. That fire had burned down to cold, hard coals of survival. He simply understood them. He understood that they were driven by a hunger that could never be sated. They wanted the silver, they wanted the land, and now they wanted the water. He stood up slowly, keeping below the skyline. He had to move. If these mercenaries were setting a trap, they would blame it on the Apache. It was the way of things. When a white man stole, it was business. When a white man killed, it was defense. But when trouble struck, the finger always pointed to the mountains, to the savages. Ina. Kai checked his own weapons, a knife at his belt, a bow across his back, and a Colt revolver he had taken from a cavalry officer 3 years ago. He turned his gaze once more toward the distant haze of Red Creek. He felt a strange pull, a vibration in the air that usually warned of a storm. But there were no clouds. He turned and began to run, his moccasins making no sound on the rock. He moved like smoke, heading not away from the danger, but parallel to it. He needed to see what these false hunters were planning. Back in Red Creek, evening was falling, turning the red dust to a deep, bruised purple. Lila sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the room Sadie had secured. The walls were thin. She could hear a man coughing in the next room and the murmur of Sadie's voice down the hall, speaking to the landlady. Lila opened her small trunk. She took out her ledger, her inkwell, and a small photograph of her husband. She placed them on the wobbly bedside table. This was her life now. A grid of numbers and a memory. "Are you ready for dinner?" Sadie burst into the room without knocking. She had changed into an even brighter dress, yellow like a dandelion. "I suppose so," Lila said, standing up. "Sadie, about the job." "Oh, hush about the job." Sadie laughed, linking her arm through Lila's again. "Tonight we celebrate. I want everyone to know you are here. I want everyone to know that Lila Garner has arrived." Lila let herself be pulled along, but a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Sadie's affection felt heavy, almost suffocating, like the heat outside. It felt like Sadie was building a wall around her, brick by brick, using smiles and loud declarations. They walked out onto the main street. The saloons were coming alive, piano music spilling out into the street. As they passed the general store, Lila saw a group of women standing by the dry town well. They stopped talking as Lila and Sadie approached. Their eyes were hard, their mouths set in thin lines. "That is the one," Lila heard one woman whisper. "The one Sadie Cale brought." "Birds of a feather," another muttered. Lila stiffened, but Sadie just laughed loudly, waving at them as if they were old friends. "Good evening. Ladies, lovely night for a stroll. Is it not?" The women did not wave back. Lila looked down at the well. It was boarded up, a heavy padlock securing the cover. A sign was nailed to it, "Water rationing in effect, by order of Mayor and Mr. Crow." "Why is the well locked?" Lila asked. "Crow controls the water," Sadie said, her voice dropping a fraction. "He says it is to ensure fair distribution. But if you have money, you don't get thirsty. Come on, Lila. Don't worry about politics on your first night." They entered the dining room of the hotel. It was crowded. As they sat down, Lila felt the collective gaze of the room turn toward them. It was the same feeling she had on the street, a mixture of curiosity and hostility. She was the stranger, the outsider in a town that was frightened and angry. She looked across the room and saw Sheriff Dodd sitting at a corner table with Silas Crow. Crow was cutting a steak, the red juice running onto his plate. He looked up, and his eyes met Lila's. He didn't smile. He just stared, chewing slowly. It was a look of assessment, of ownership. Lila looked away, focusing on the menu. "Sadie," she said softly, "I get the feeling this town is complicated. Life is complicated." "Lila," Sadie said, reaching across the table to pat Lila's hand. Her palm was damp. "But we are survivors. You and me. We do what we have to do." "I just want to do my work," Lila said firmly. "Honest work. Of course." Sadie smiled, but her eyes did not crinkle at the corners. Honest work. Outside, the wind picked up, swirling the red dust into small devils that danced down the street. High on the ridge, Kai stopped running. He had found the tracks of the mercenaries again. They had stopped near a narrow canyon, the perfect choke point for a stagecoach or a wagon. He knelt down, touching the earth. It was still warm. He looked toward the town again, his steady gaze piercing the darkness. He did not know Lila Garner. He did not know that she was sitting in a dining room feeling the walls closing in. But he knew that the threads of fate were tightening. The drought, the silver, the soldiers, the town, it was all weaving together into a trap. And as Lila looked out the window of the dining room into the pitch-black night, she shivered. Despite the heat, she felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, and the ground beneath her feet was made of nothing but dry sand and secrets. The waitress brought their food. "Welcome to Red Creek, honey," she said to Lila, her voice tired. "Don't let the dust get in your eyes. Once it's in there, you can never wash it out." Lila nodded, picking up her fork. She had $40 in her pocket, a friend who was trying too hard, and a job that started at 8 in the morning. She would survive this. She had to. But in the shadows of the alleyway across the street, a man struck a match, lighting a cigarette. The brief flare illuminated the face of one of the hunters Kai had been tracking. He wasn't in the canyon. He was here, and he was watching the hotel window where Lila sat. The match went out. The darkness returned, absolute and unforgiving. The sound that shattered Lila's sleep was not the wind, nor the settling of the timber in the boarding house. It was the sharp, cracking report of a Winchester rifle, followed immediately by the screams of horses and men. Lila sat bolt upright in the darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs. The thin walls of the room she shared with Sadie seemed to vibrate with the commotion rising from the street below. She looked over at the other bed. It was empty. The sheets were rumpled, but cold. Before she could swing her legs out of bed, the door burst open. Sadie stumbled in, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a shawl around her shoulders. "Lila! Oh, God! Lila! Stay inside!" Sadie gasped, slamming the door and leaning against it. "It is the payroll wagon, the one from the Silver Queen mine. They say it was hit just outside of town." Lila reached for her wrapper, her mind racing. "Hit, you mean robbed?" "Robbed and shot to pieces," Sadie sobbed, sliding down the doorframe to the floor. "Deputy Miller is hurt bad. They brought him into the saloon. There is blood everywhere." Lila moved to comfort her friend, kneeling on the rough floorboards. "Sadie, breathe. We are safe here. It has nothing to do with us." But as the shouting outside grew louder, turning from panicked cries into an angry roar, the door handle turned violently. Sadie scrambled away. The wood splintered near the lock, and the door was kicked open. Sheriff Ephraim Dodd stood in the hallway, his chest heaving. He held a lantern in one hand and a revolver in the other. Behind him stood Silas Crow, looking less like a concerned citizen and more like a judge who had already written the verdict. "Get dressed," Dodd barked at Lila. "Both of you." "Sheriff, what is the meaning of this?" Lila stood up, pulling her wrapper tight. "We have been asleep." Dodd stepped into the room, the lantern light swinging wildly, casting long, distorted shadows. "Asleep, is that right? Then why did the driver of the wagon say the ambushers knew exactly where the strongbox was hidden under the seat? They knew the schedule, down to the minute. Crow stepped forward, his boots heavy on the floor. Someone talked. Miss Garner, someone with a head for numbers and schedules. Someone who has been asking questions. Lila looked at Crow, then at Dodd, confusion knitting her brow. I just arrived today. I do not know the schedule. I do not know anyone here except... She turned to Sadie, expecting indignation, expecting defense. Sadie was weeping into her hands, her shoulders shaking. I am sorry, Lila, she whimpered, her voice muffled but distinct enough for everyone to hear. I told the sheriff. I had to. I could not let them think it was me. Lila froze. The air seemed to leave the room. What did you tell him? Sadie looked up, her eyes swimming with tears that looked terrified, yet her voice held a strange, rehearsed quality. You asked me about the bank's safe. You asked when the silver comes in from the mines. You said you needed money to get back east, but I did not think you would actually do it. Sadie, Lila's voice was a whisper of shock. That is a lie. I never asked. Save it for the judge. If you live that long. Dodd snarled. He moved to Lila's open trunk at the foot of the bed. Let us see what the lady brought to town. He began tossing her neatly folded clothes onto the floor, her white shirtwaists, her dark skirts, her undergarments. The humiliation burned Lila's face, but the shock of Sadie's words kept her rooted to the spot. Well now, Dodd said, straightening up. He held up a piece of coarse cloth. It was stained dark gray. Ore dust, high grade, the kind that comes off a transport bag. He reached back into the trunk and pulled out a heavy iron key and a scrap of paper covered in dots and dashes. And look here, a key to the bank's rear storage, and a coded message. Dodd shoved the paper toward Crow. Lila stared at the items. I have never seen those before. That cloth, that key, they are not mine. And that paper, she squinted at it in the lantern light. That is not a real message. That is gibberish. Any operator could tell you. Enough, Crow's voice boomed, silencing the room. He took the paper, looking at it with feigned gravity. It looks like a signal code to me. A way to alert your partners outside of town. He looked at Lila, his expression shifting to a mask of pity that made Lila's skin crawl. Miss Garner, you are a woman alone in a hard land. Perhaps you were coerced. Perhaps you made a mistake. If you give us the names of the men you are working with, the men who shot Deputy Miller, I can promise you leniency. We can protect you. I have no partners, Lila cried, her accountant's mind trying to find a foothold in this madness. This is illogical. Why would I keep evidence in my trunk on the first night? Why would I rob a town I just moved to Sadie? Please, tell them. She turned to her friend, but Sadie refused to meet her eyes. She was staring at the floor, picking at a loose thread on her shawl. Take her, Crow said, his voice cold. The town needs justice. Ephraim. They need to know the snake has been caught. Dodd grabbed Lila by the arm, his grip bruising, as he dragged her out of the room and down the stairs. Lila saw the faces of the other boarders in the doorways. There was no sympathy, only fear and anger. The story had already spread. The stranger, the widow, the thief. Outside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and torch smoke. A crowd had gathered. When they saw Lila, a roar went up. That is her, a woman shouted, the same woman who had whispered by the well earlier. She has the devil's luck, a harlot and a thief. Hang her, a miner yelled, waving a bottle. Miller is dying because of her. Someone threw a handful of dirt. It struck Lila in the face, the grit getting into her eyes and mouth. She tried to speak, tried to shout that she was innocent, that she was a bookkeeper who believed in order and truth, but her voice was drowned out by the chaotic noise of the mob. She does not look like much, a man spat as she was hauled past him. Just a woman. What does a woman know about honor? Dodd shoved her into the small stone building that served as the jail. He pushed her into the single cell and slammed the iron door shut. The clang of the metal echoed in Lila's skull. She stumbled to the cot, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She gripped the bars, looking out into the office. You are making a mistake, she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Check the handwriting on that paper. Check the key. It will not fit any lock I have access to." Dodd ignored her, sitting at his desk and putting his feet up. Crow stood by the window, watching the angry mob outside. "They are loud tonight," Crow observed calmly. "They are bloodthirsty." Dodd grunted. "You sure about this, Silas?" "She is a tiny thing. Does not look like she could lift a Winchester." "It does not matter what she looks like," Crow said, turning from the window. He spoke low, but in the silence of the jail, Lila heard every word. "The people are angry. They are thirsty. They are scared of the railroad coming and taking their land. If they do not have someone to hate, they might start hating me. Or you. But the girl—" Dodd hesitated. "Let them be angry at the right place," Crow said, lighting a cigar. "By tomorrow, when we hang her, the town will feel safer. They will trust us to protect them. And when the railroad buys the water rights next month, no one will argue." Lila sank back onto the cot, the horror of it washing over her. It was not a mistake. It was a transaction. She was an asset to be liquidated for the sake of public order. Hours passed. The mob outside quieted down, settling into a sullen vigil at the saloon across the street. The moonlight slanted through the high, barred window of the cell. The outer door opened softly. Sadie slipped in. She was no longer crying. She carried a small bundle of food wrapped in a napkin. "Sheriff," Sadie called out softly. Dodd, who had been dozing, looked up. "5 minutes, Sadie." "Crow said you could say goodbye, but do not try anything stupid." Sadie walked to the cell bars. She did not offer the food. She just stood there, looking at Lila. The moonlight caught her face, stripping away the soft, bubbly mask Lila had known for years. Her eyes were hard, calculating, and frighteningly empty. "Why?" Lila whispered, standing up and gripping the cold iron. "We starved together, Sadie. I shared my bread with you." "And that was then," Sadie said, her voice a flat whisper. "This is now. Look at you, Lila. You always had your numbers. You always had your pride. You thought you could just walk in here and fix things. I came because you asked me to. I asked you because I needed a way out," Sadie hissed, leaning closer. "Crow promised me the deed to the boarding house if I helped him. He needed a stranger, someone with no kin, no husband to come looking." Lila recoiled as if slapped. "You sold me." "For a boarding house. I need Red Creek. Lila," Sadie said, a cruel smile touching her lips. "I am tired of running. I am tired of being poor. You are just the price of admission." Sadie dropped the bundle of food on the floor outside the cell, just out of reach. "Eat up. You will need your strength for the walk to the cottonwood tree tomorrow." She turned and walked out, her heels clicking on the floor. She did not look back. Lila stood alone in the silence. The betrayal felt like a physical wound in her chest, bleeding her dry. But as the shock faded, something else took its place. A cold, hard clarity. It was the same clarity she felt when a ledger did not balance, when the numbers were wrong. You did not cry. You found the error. She was the error, and she had to remove herself from the equation. She looked at the lock on the cell door. It was an old model, heavy iron, the kind used in mining camps before the territory became a state. She had seen similar ones when she worked the telegraph office in the last town. The marshal there had lost his keys often. Lila reached into her hair and pulled out a long, sturdy hairpin. It was steel, not cheap tin. She sat on the floor, listening. Dodd was snoring at his desk. She slipped her hand through the bars. The angle was awkward. She inserted the pin into the keyhole. She closed her eyes, visualizing the tumblers inside. Click, resistance, click. It was not magic. It was physics. It was tension and torque. Her father had been a watchmaker before the whiskey took him, and he had taught her that every machine had a secret language. You just had to know how to speak it. Her fingers cramped. Sweat stung her eyes. Outside, a bottle smashed. Click! The final tumbler gave way. Lila turned the makeshift pick. The bolt slid back with a groan that sounded like a thunderclap in the quiet jail. She froze. Dodd shifted in his chair, snorted, and settled back into his rhythm of snores. Lila pushed the door open, inch by inch. She did not breathe. She slipped out of the cell, her boots silent on the floor. She moved past the sleeping sheriff, past the rack of rifles on the wall. She wanted to take a weapon, but the risk of noise was too great. She reached the back door of the office. It was barred from the inside. She lifted the wooden beam, her muscles straining to keep it from thudding against the floor. She eased the door open and stepped out into the alley. The night air hit her face, dry and cooling. But she was not safe, not yet. She kept to the shadows, moving behind the livery stable, avoiding the main street where the drunken vigilantes were still awake. She could not steal a horse. The stables were guarded, and a horse was loud. She had to walk. She headed south, away from the road, toward the vast, empty expanse of the desert. She knew enough to know that the desert was death for the unprepared, but the town was death for the innocent. She walked for what felt like hours, putting the lights of Red Creek behind her. Her feet blistered in her boots. The hem of her skirt tore on the thorny mesquite brush, as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, painting the horizon in bruised shades of violet and orange. A sound drifted on the wind. It was the distant, rhythmic thud of hooves. Lila stopped and turned back. Far away, a cloud of dust was rising from the direction of the town. They had found the empty cell. The posse was coming. She stood alone in the center of a vast bowl of red dust and sagebrush. The landscape was alien, harsh and indifferent to her suffering. There was no water in sight, no shelter, just the endless rolling scrubland and the rising sun that promised a day of furnace heat. "Breathe," she whispered to herself, the word lost in the vastness. "Just breathe." Behind her, the shouts of men carried over the miles, faint but unmistakable. "Find her! Do not let her reach the canyon!" Lila turned her back on civilization and faced the wild. She began to run, a small, dark figure against the immensity of the earth, running toward the only thing that offered a chance of survival, the jagged, unforgiving rocks where the Apache were said to hide. The sun was not a celestial body here. It was a hammer, and the earth was the anvil, and Lila Garner was the scrap of iron caught between them. She had been walking for what felt like a lifetime, though the angle of the shadows suggested it had only been 6 or 7 hours since she fled the jail. Her boots, sensible leather meant for the boardwalks of civilized towns, were now instruments of torture. Every step sent a jolt of pain up her shins. The hem of her skirt was heavy with burrs and red dust, dragging behind her like a prisoner's chain. Thirst was a living thing in her throat. It started as a dryness, then became a scratch, and now it felt as though she had swallowed a handful of the sharp sand that stretched endlessly in every direction. She stumbled, her foot catching on a hidden root of a mesquite bush. She fell hard, the palms of her hands shredding against the gravel. Lila lay there for a moment, the heat pressing her into the ground. It would be so easy to stay, to close her eyes and let the sun finish what the town of Red Creek had started. The silence of the desert was absolute, a ringing void that made her own ragged breathing sound like a gale. "Get up," the voice of her father whispered in her memory. "The ledger must balance. Lila, you cannot leave the page half-written." She pushed herself up, her arms trembling. She looked around, her vision blurring at the edges. The landscape was a chaotic jumble of red rock, spiny cholla cactus that looked soft from a distance but tore flesh up close, and vast, blinding white alkali flats. She took a step, then another. She was aiming for a cluster of rocks that offered a sliver of shade. Perhaps 100 yards away, it seemed to recede as she walked. Then she saw him. He did not emerge from the rocks. It was as if the rocks simply rearranged themselves to reveal him. He stood on a ridge about 30 feet above her, motionless against the glare of the sky. Lila gasped, stumbling back. Her mind, feverish with dehydration and fear, immediately conjured the stories the women in town whispered: the Apache, the raiders, the ghosts of the territory. He was tall and lean, built of corded muscle and intent. He wore buckskin breeches and a calico shirt that had faded to the color of the dust. His hair was long, held back by a strip of cloth. But it was his face that arrested her. It was not painted for war. It was calm, composed of sharp planes and angles, like a cliff face weathered by centuries of wind. He held a rifle loosely in one hand, the barrel pointing at the ground. He was not aiming at her. He was simply watching. Lila tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. She raised a hand, a weak, defensive gesture. She expected a war cry. She expected violence. Instead, the man moved. He descended the slope with a fluidity that mocked her own clumsy stumbling. He did not dislodge a single stone. He moved like water flowing downhill. He stopped 5 paces from her. His eyes were dark, impossibly deep, and they held a gaze so steady it felt like a physical touch. He did not look at her with the lust of the men in the saloon, nor the hatred of the women in the church. He looked at her as a surveyor looks at a landscape, measuring, assessing, determining the truth of what stood before him. He reached for a canteen slung over his shoulder. It was an old army canteen, wrapped in wool. He uncorked it, the sound of the wet stopper popping loud in the silence. Lila lurched forward, her hands grasping. He stepped back, keeping the canteen out of reach. "Slowly," he said. His voice was deep, the English clear and unaccented, stripped of any affectation. "If you drink too fast, you will die." Lila froze. The clarity of his speech cut through her panic. He stepped forward again and held the canteen to her lips, tilting it just enough to wet them. The water was warm and tasted of tin, but to Lila, it was sweeter than the finest wine. She tried to gulp, but he pulled it away. "Breathe," he commanded. Again. He allowed her another small sip, then another. He was rationing her. She realized. He was managing her survival with the same detached efficiency one might use to tend a horse foundered on the trail. "Who are you?" she rasped, her voice sounding like grinding stones. "I am called Kai," he said. He capped the canteen. "You are the woman from the town, the one they say stole the silver." Lila stiffened, stepping back. "I did not steal anything. They lied." Kai looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her torn dress, her bleeding hands, the desperation in her posture. "I know," he said simply. "A thief runs with a horse and a gun. You run with nothing but fear." He gestured to the north. "Sit in the shade. The sun is high. We cannot move yet." Lila hesitated. Every instinct she had been raised with screamed that this man was the enemy. But the town behind her wanted to hang her. This man had given her water. She walked to the overhang of the rock and collapsed into the shadow. Kai sat opposite her, cross-legged, his rifle across his knees. He pulled a small pouch from his belt and began to mix a paste of dried leaves and saliva in his palm. Without asking, he reached out and took her hand. Lila flinched, but his grip was firm. He applied the green paste to the raw scrapes on her palms. It stung for a moment, then cooled into a dull numbness. "Why help me?" Lila asked, watching him work. "The sheriff says your people are the ones who robbed the stages. He says you are savages." Kai did not look up. "The sheriff says many things. He says the Apache poisoned the well. He says we burned the barns." He finished with her hand and looked her in the eye. "There is a group of men, 6 of them. They ride like soldiers but dress like drifters. I found their tracks near the place where the wagon was attacked. They wore boots with a heavy heel, shod with iron. My people wear moccasins." Lila's mind, sharpened by the water, began to turn. "Mercenaries," she whispered. "Hired guns. They robbed the wagon." Kai continued, his voice devoid of anger but heavy with warning. "They kill the deputy, and they leave an arrow in the wood to blame the Apache. If the town believes we did it, the soldiers come. They kill my people. They take the little land we have left." "So you are not saving me," Lila said, a bitter realization settling in. "You are saving your people." "Is there a difference today?" Kai asked. Before Lila could answer, Kai suddenly froze. He turned his head slightly, his ear toward the wind. He did not move a muscle, but the air around him seemed to tighten. "They are coming," he said softly. "Who? The men with ropes?" Lila scrambled up, panic rising again. "We have to run." "No," Kai said, standing up slowly. "Running leaves tracks. We vanish." He grabbed her arm, not roughly, but with an urgency that brokered no argument. He led her away from the sandy wash and onto the hard, slick rock of the canyon wall. "Step where I step," he instructed. "Do not break the brush. Do not disturb the stones." For the next hour, Lila learned what it meant to be a ghost. Kai led her through a maze of sandstone crevices, jumping from boulder to boulder. He moved with a terrifying grace. When she stumbled, he caught her. When she breathed too loud, he held a finger to his lips. They reached a high, narrow fissure in the rock face, hidden behind a screen of twisted juniper. Kai pushed her inside, into the cool darkness. He crouched at the entrance, peering through the branches. Below them, on the valley floor, the posse appeared. Lila recognized Sheriff Dodd's white hat. There were 10 of them, men she had seen in the saloon, men who had likely tipped their hats to her when she arrived yesterday. Now they carried rifles and looked at the ground like hounds. "Lost the tracks," she heard Dodd shout, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Damned wind swept them clean. She cannot have gone far," another man yelled. "Not on foot. Maybe the desert got her," Dodd replied. "Or the Apache. If they got her, she is dead already." Lila shivered. She was inches away from discovery, yet Kai seemed entirely unconcerned. He was part of the stone. He watched them with that steady, unblinking gaze. He was not afraid of these men. He pitied their blindness. They waited there for 2 hours until the posse turned back toward Red Creek, defeated by the heat and the rock. When the silence returned, Lila slumped against the cave wall. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the crumpled piece of paper that Dodd had claimed was a coded message. She pulled it out. "This paper," she said, smoothing it out on her knee. "Sadie, my friend, she planted it on me. Dodd said it was a code for the robbers." Kai glanced at it. "It looks like scratches." "No," Lila said, looking closer in the dim light. "I was too panicked to see it before. Look at the way the numbers are formed. The 7 has a line through it, and the decimal points are marked with a small X. That is not how a bandit writes. That is not even how a telegraph operator writes." She looked up at Kai, her eyes wide. "That is bank notation. Specifically, it is the shorthand used by Mr. Henderson, the bank manager. I saw his ledger on his desk for a brief second when I went to introduce myself." "The banker is with the sheriff," Kai stated. "And with Crow," Lila added. "It is a circle. Crow wants the land. He needs the town to be afraid so they will sell. He hires men to rob the payroll to make them poor and afraid of you. He frames me to give the town someone to hate immediately. It is a balance sheet of terror." Kai looked at her with a new expression. It was respect. "You see the trail clearly, even without looking at the ground." "I am a bookkeeper," Lila said, a spark of defiance returning to her voice. "I know when the accounts have been cooked. We cannot stay here." Kai said, "The soldiers will come next. I must take you to a place they will not look." They moved out as the sun began to lower, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and gold. They walked for miles, deeper into the broken country where the white men rarely ventured. Lila's feet bled, but she did not complain. She watched Kai. She watched how he moved, how he respected the land, how he took nothing for granted. By nightfall, they reached a small encampment tucked into a box canyon. It was not a village, just 2 wickiups made of brush and canvas. An old man sat by a small fire, and a woman was grinding corn on a flat stone. The woman looked up as they approached. She was older than Kai, with streaks of gray in her hair. This was Ishta. Her eyes narrowed when she saw Lila. She spoke to Kai in their tongue, her tone sharp and questioning. Kai answered calmly, gesturing to Lila, then to the north, then to the west. He spoke at length. The old man, whose face was a map of wrinkles, looked at Lila. "He says you are hunted," the old man said in broken English. "He says you carry the truth." "I hope so," Lila said softly. "My sister asks why he brings a white woman to our fire." The old man translated as Ishta spoke again. "She says white women bring only trouble and soldiers." Kai spoke one word, firm and final. Ishta sighed, shaking her head, but she gestured for Lila to sit. She handed Lila a bowl of stew. It was meager, mostly broth, but she offered it with 2 hands. Lila ate, the warmth spreading through her chest. She watched Kai across the fire. He was cleaning his rifle, his movements rhythmic and soothing. He had saved her life. He had walked her through hell, and he had asked for nothing. Later, as the fire burned down to embers, the camp fell silent. Ishta and the old man retired to their shelters. Lila sat wrapped in a blanket, looking up at the stars. They seemed brighter here, sharper. Kai came and sat near her. He did not sit too close, respecting the space between them, yet close enough that she could feel his presence as a comfort. "Your shoulder," he said, pointing to a tear in her dress where a branch had gouged her skin. "It is bleeding." "It is nothing," Lila said. "In the desert, nothing becomes something very quickly," Kai said. He reached out with a clean cloth and a small jar of salve. Lila turned toward him. He cleaned the wound gently. His hands were rough, calloused from war and survival, but his touch was incredibly light. She looked at his face in the firelight. He was focused on his task, his lashes casting long shadows on his cheeks. "You speak English very well," she said. "I spent 3 years at the reservation school," Kai said, his voice tightening slightly. "They taught me to speak like a white man. They tried to teach me to think like one. They failed." He finished bandaging her shoulder and looked up. Their eyes met. For the first time, Lila did not see an Apache. She did not see a warrior. She saw a man who was tired of fighting but would not stop. She saw a loneliness that matched her own, and in his eyes, that steady, unyielding gaze, she saw her own reflection. Not the widow, not the thief, not the victim. "Just a woman. Thank you," she whispered. "Do not thank me yet," Kai said. "You are still alive, but you are not free." "I cannot stay here," Lila said, the thought forming as she spoke it. "If I stay, I am a fugitive forever, and your people will be blamed for the robbery. Crow will use it to bring the army." "Yes," Kai said. "War is coming." "I have the key," Lila said, touching her pocket. The key, Dodd said, was for the bank. If it was planted, it must open something important, something they did not want me to find, or something they want to claim I opened. "The evidence," Kai said. "I have to go back." Lila said. She felt a tremble of fear, but her voice was steady. "I have to get into that bank. I have to find the ledger that matches this paper. If I can prove Crow and the banker are stealing the silver themselves, the town will turn on them." Kai looked at her for a long time. The fire crackled. "Going back is death," he said. "Staying hidden is a slow death," Lila countered. "For me, and for your people." Kai nodded slowly. A faint smile, barely there, touched his lips. "You have the heart of a badger, small but fierce." He stood up and looked toward the north, toward Red Creek. "We go back," Kai said. "I will take you. We will find this paper, and we will stop the lies." Lila stood beside him. She was exhausted, battered, and hunted. But as she stood next to the Apache warrior under the vast, indifferent sky, she felt stronger than she had ever felt in the safety of a town. "We go back," she repeated. The wind blew through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of a storm. The moon hung low over Red Creek, a sliver of bone in a black sky. The town was asleep, but it was a restless, feverish sleep. Even in the silence, the tension remained, thick as the dust that coated every rooftop. Lila, Garner, and Kai lay flat on their stomachs on a bluff overlooking the northern perimeter of the town. They had moved like shadows across the desert floor, Kai guiding her steps so that not a single pebble skittered out of place. "Watch," Kai whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. Below them, near the secondary well, the only other source of water besides the main reservoir Crow controlled, two figures moved. They carried heavy sacks. Lila squinted, recognizing the silhouette of one of the men. It was the foreman of Crow's ranch. She watched in horror as they cut the sacks open and dumped a coarse, gray powder into the well. It was not poison, perhaps, but it was slag, refuse from the mines, enough to foul the water and make it undrinkable for days. Then, one of the men pulled something from his belt. He drove it into the wooden frame of the well, even from this distance. Lila recognized the fletching. "An Apache arrow," she breathed. "They poisoned the water, then blamed the ghost," Kai said, his jaw set hard. "By morning, the town will be thirsty. By noon, they will be hunting for blood. My people's blood." "It is a script," Lila said, anger replacing her fear. "He is writing a play, and we are just actors to him. We have to stop this." "The telegraph office," Kai said. "We go now." They slipped down the embankment. Entering the town was like walking into the mouth of a sleeping wolf. Every creak of a sign swinging in the wind sounded like a gunshot. Kai moved with a terrifying silence, checking corners, listening to the rhythm of the night. Lila followed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Clutching the stolen key in her pocket, the bank and the telegraph office shared a building on the corner of Main Street. The windows were dark. Kai motioned for her to wait. He picked up a handful of dirt and tossed it gently against the side of the building. A dog barked 2 streets over, but no guard appeared. "Go," he whispered. "I will watch the street." Lila crept to the back door. Her hands trembled as she inserted the key found in her trunk, the key Sadie had claimed was stolen. It turned in the lock with a smooth, heavy click. It fit perfectly. It was the spare key, the one the manager kept. She slipped inside. The air smelled of ink, old paper, and stale cigar smoke. She knew this smell. It was the smell of her trade. She moved to the telegraph desk. She did not dare light a lamp. She had to work by feel and by the faint moonlight filtering through the dusty window. She found the logbook. It was a ledger recording incoming and outgoing messages. She ran her finger down the entries for the last 2 days. Most were mundane orders for mining equipment. News of family. Then she stopped. There was an outgoing message sent 2 nights ago, hours before the robbery. It was addressed to a Captain J. Holt in Tucson. The message was coded, but the translation was scribbled in pencil in the margin, arrogance born of the belief that no one else would ever see it. Package arrives Tuesday noon. Hit at Box Canyon. Make it look like Redskins. Payment awaits at ranch. "Crow," Lila whispered. She turned the page. There was another message. "Incoming. From yesterday. Job done. Town is yours. Awaiting final payment." She ripped the page from the ledger, folding it carefully into her bodice. This was it, the smoking gun. It proved the robbery was staged. The hunters were mercenaries, and Crow was the architect. Suddenly, voices drifted through the front window. Lila froze, crouching behind the heavy oak desk. 2 men were walking past on the boardwalk. One was Sheriff Dodd. The other was a voice she knew too well. "She is probably dead in the desert by now." "Sadie," Dodd was saying, his voice rough. "No woman lasts 2 days out there without water." "I hope so," Sadie replied. Her voice was not fearful anymore. It was cold, hard, and ugly. "But until you find the body, the town will not settle. I told the ladies at the sewing circle that Lila had a history of this, that she seduced a banker in the last town and ran off with the vault key. They ate it up. They are calling her a harlot and a witch." "You are a wicked thing." "Sadie Cale," Dodd chuckled. "I am a survivor," Sadie snapped. "Crow promised me the deed to the boarding house. I earned it. If Lila has to be the scapegoat so I can sleep in a bed of my own, so be it. She was always too soft anyway, too high and mighty with her books and her morals." They passed by. Lila sat in the dark, tears of rage stinging her eyes. Sadie was not just protecting herself, she was actively destroying Lila's name, painting her as a monster to justify her own greed. It was a betrayal so complete it left Lila breathless. "Lila!" The whisper came from the back door. It was Kai. "We must go. The guard is changing." Lila scrambled up, clutching the paper. But as she turned, her boot caught the leg of the heavy iron stool. It scraped across the floor with a screech that sounded like a scream in the quiet night. "Who is in there?" a voice shouted from the street. "Run!" Kai hissed. He did not wait for her to reach the door. He stepped inside, grabbing her arm, but the front door was already being kicked in. Sheriff Dodd stood there, his lantern raised, the light blinding. "Well, well," Dodd snarled, drawing his revolver. "The ghost returns." He fired. The bullet shattered a glass inkwell on the desk, spraying shards and black ink. Kai did not freeze. He moved with an explosion of speed. He threw a heavy ledger at the sheriff, knocking the aim of the second shot wide. Then he swept Lila off her feet, literally lifting her as he kicked the back door open. "Stop them!" Dodd screamed. "They are at the bank!" Gunshots erupted from the street. Bullets chewed into the wood frame of the door. Kai pushed Lila into the alleyway. "Up," he commanded, pointing to a stack of crates leading to the low roof of the livery stable next door. Lila climbed, her skirts tangling, her breath sobbing in her throat. She hauled herself onto the roof. Kai followed, vaulting up just as a deputy ran into the alley. "There, on the roof!" A rifle cracked. Kai jerked violently, stumbling forward. "Kai!" Lila screamed. "Go!" he grunted, shoving her forward. They ran across the rooftops, leaping the narrow gaps between the buildings. Below them, the town was waking up. Men were shouting, dogs were barking, and the sound of boots on wood was everywhere. They reached the end of the row. Below was the dark shadow of the lumber yard, and beyond that, the open desert. "Jump!" Kai said. They jumped together, landing in a pile of sawdust. They scrambled up and ran, disappearing into the darkness just as the mob reached the edge of town. They did not stop running until the lights of Red Creek were faint stars behind them. They found shelter in a small, shallow cave halfway up a mesa, miles from the town. It was tight, barely big enough for two, but it was defensible. Lila collapsed against the stone, her lungs burning. She looked over at Kai. He was sitting near the entrance, his rifle across his lap. He was breathing heavily, and there was a dark stain spreading on his left shoulder. "You are hurt," Lila said, crawling toward him. "It is a scratch," Kai said through gritted teeth. "Let me see." She pushed his hand away. The bullet had furrowed a deep groove across the deltoid muscle. It was bleeding freely, soaking his shirt. "We need to stop the bleeding," Lila said, her voice surprisingly steady. The panic of the flight had vanished, replaced by a singular focus. She tore a strip from her petticoat, the white cotton already stained with red dust, and uncorked their precious water canteen. "This will hurt," she whispered. Kai did not flinch as she cleaned the wound. He watched her. The firelight from the small match she struck to sterilize a needle flickered in his eyes. He did not look at the wound. He looked only at her face. Lila worked quickly, her fingers deft. She had no anesthesia, no doctor's tools, only a needle from her travel kit and thread. As she stitched the skin, she could feel the tension in his muscles, the heat radiating from his body. "Why did you come inside?" she asked softly, tying off the thread. "You could have run. You knew they would shoot an Apache on sight. I could not leave you," Kai said. His voice was low, vibrating in the small space. Lila looked up. Her hands were on his chest, resting over his heart. She could feel it beating slow, strong, steady. "Sadie said, she said the town thinks I'm a monster," Lila whispered, the pain of the betrayal surfacing again. "She made them hate me. I am nothing to them now, just a target." "They are blind," Kai said. He reached up, his hand covering hers. His skin was rough, warm, and alive. They see what they fear. They see a thief. They see a savage. He leaned closer, and the space between them seemed to charge with electricity. I do not see a thief, Kai said. I see the woman who walked through the desert. I see the woman who broke into a bank to find the truth. I see the woman who stitches my flesh while her own hands are bleeding. Lila trembled. It was not from fear. It was from the sheer intensity of his presence. He was stripping away the layers of shame and doubt that the town had piled on her. Lila. He said her name like it was a prayer in a language she was just learning. You are not forgotten. Not by the earth. Not by me. She looked into his eyes, that steady gaze that had anchored her since the first moment in the desert. It was the only true thing in a world of lies. Kai, she breathed. She leaned in, and he met her halfway. The kiss was not frantic. It was not the desperate grasping of two people afraid to die. It was an affirmation of life. His lips were firm, tasting of salt and smoke. His hand moved to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair, pulling her closer, deepening the contact. Lila melted against him, her body arching to meet his. For a moment, there was no Red Creek, no crow, no hanging rope. There was only the heat of his skin, the strength of his arm around her waist, and the overwhelming realization that she had found her home not in a place, but in a person. The kiss lingered, heavy with promise and unspoken desire, before they slowly pulled apart. They rested their foreheads together, breathing the same air. The darkness of the cave wrapped around them, intimate and protective. We are alive, Kai whispered against her skin. Yes, Lila replied. But for how long? She pulled back slightly, her hand lingering on his cheek. We cannot let this make us blind. Kai, if we stay here, if we let this be enough, they win. Kai nodded, his expression serious again. The warrior returned, but the softness remained in his eyes. Love does not make us blind, Lila. It makes us dangerous, because now we have something to lose. A sound of shifting rocks outside made them both freeze. Kai grabbed his rifle, positioning himself in front of Lila. Don't shoot, a voice hissed from the darkness. It is me, Pike. A young man stumbled into the dim light of the cave entrance. It was Deputy Noah Pike. He looked terrified, his hat missing, his uniform dusty. He held his hands up high. Noah, Lila asked, stepping out from behind Kai. How did you find us? I followed the blood, Pike said, eyeing Kai nervously. And I know where the Apache hide when the wind blows this way. My grandfather was a tracker. He looked at Lila, his face pale. Miss Garner, you have to know. Dodd isn't waiting for the circuit judge. What do you mean? Lila asked, a cold dread pooling in her stomach. He says the jail isn't safe with savages raiding the town. Pike gasped, catching his breath. Crow has stirred them up into a frenzy. They are building a gallows in the square right now. Dodd set the execution for dawn. Dawn! Lila looked at the sliver of sky. The stars were already turning pale. That is less than 2 hours. He wants it done before the USS. Marshal gets here from Tucson. Pike explained. He knows if the marshal looks at the books or talks to you, the whole scheme falls apart. He is going to hang you in effigy if he can't find you. But if he catches you... We have the proof, Lila said, patting her bodice where the ledger page lay. We have the messages. It doesn't matter if you have it here, Pike said desperately. You need to show it to the people. You need to read it out loud before they kick the lever. Once the sun comes up, Crow wins. Lila looked at Kai. He was already checking the load in his rifle. He stood up, wincing slightly as his shoulder moved, but his face was set in stone. 2 hours, Kai said. It is a long ride. We don't have horses, Lila said. I brought 2, Pike said, pointing down the slope. I stole them from the livery. I couldn't let them do this. Miss Garner, it isn't right. Lila looked at the young deputy, seeing the fear and the courage warring in his face. Thank you. Noah, she turned to Kai. The moment of peace was over. The reality of the rope was back. If we go back, Kai said, his voice low, meant only for her. We ride into the center of the fire. I know, Lila said. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it hard. But we have the truth, and we have each other. Kai tightened his grip. Then we ride. They moved out of the cave, the cold pre-dawn air biting at their skin. To the east, the horizon was beginning to bleed a faint, bloody red. Dawn was coming, and with it, the hangman. Lila mounted the horse Pike had brought. She looked at Red Creek in the distance. It was no longer a town to her. It was a battlefield. She was not running away anymore. She was charging in. The dawn broke over Red Creek, not with the promise of a new day, but like a fresh wound opening in the sky. The light was a bruised, violent crimson that stained the dust of the main street and made the faces of the gathering crowd look flushed with fever. They had been gathering since the first rooster crowed, drawn by the hammering of the carpenters who had erected a hasty wooden platform in front of the livery stable. A heavy beam extended out from the hayloft, and from it dangled a coil of hemp rope, the noose swaying gently in the breathless morning air. Lila Garner sat on her horse in the shadow of the alleyway, just feet from the square, her heart beating a rhythm against her ribs that felt loud enough to wake the dead. Beside her, Deputy Noah Pike looked pale, his hands gripping his reins so tight his knuckles were white. Kai was gone. He had melted away into the architecture of the town moments before, seeking the high ground. "They are ready for a show," Pike whispered, his voice trembling. "They are ready for blood," Lila corrected. She smoothed the front of her riding skirt, feeling the crinkle of the ledger page tucked against her skin. "Let us give them the truth instead." Before Pike could argue, Lila kicked her horse forward. She rode out of the shadows and into the center of the square. For a heartbeat, there was silence. The crowd miners with coal-stained eyes, women in bonnets clutching Bibles. Shopkeepers who had denied her service stared in disbelief. They had expected a manhunt. They had not expected the prey to walk into the trap. "There she is!" a voice shrieked. It was Sadie Cale. Sadie stood on the platform next to Sheriff Dodd and Silas Crow. She wore a black dress, playing the role of the grieving citizen to perfection. She pointed a trembling finger at Lila. "The thief, the woman who brought the Apache down on us." The spell broke. The crowd roared. A surge of bodies rushed toward Lila. Rough hands grabbed her bridle. Someone pulled at her leg. "Get off that horse." Lila did not fight them. She let herself be pulled down, stumbling into the dust. Sheriff Dodd marched down the steps, his face twisted in a triumphant sneer. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip bruising, and dragged her toward the stairs of the platform. "You have saved us the trouble of hunting you down," Dodd shouted over the noise. "String her up, Justice, for Deputy Miller." Lila was shoved up the stairs. The world spun. She saw the faces of the townspeople below. They were not looking at her as a person. They were looking at her as a vessel for all their fear, their thirst, and their anger. They did not want justice. They wanted a simple story. They wanted to believe that killing her would bring back the rain and the silver. Crow stepped forward, raising his hands for silence. He looked like a benevolent patriarch, though his eyes were as cold as a snake's. "Citizens of Red Creek," Crow boomed. "We stand here not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. This woman, a stranger, conspired with the savages to rob our payroll and poison our water, and we have a witness." He turned to Sadie. Sadie stepped forward. She would not meet Lila's eyes. She looked out at the crowd, tears streaming down her face, tears that Lila now recognized as the water of a crocodile. "She told me," Sadie sobbed, her voice carrying clearly. "Last night, before she ran, she told me she hated this town. She told me she gave the key to the bank to an Apache warrior. She laughed about it. She said, you were all fools." A collective gasp went through the crowd, followed by a low, animalistic growl of rage. "Liar!" Lila screamed, straining against the sheriff's grip. "Tell them the truth! Sadie, tell them about the boarding house deed!" "She is mad," Sadie cried, hiding her face in her hands. "Just hang her and be done with it." Dodd grabbed the noose. The rough hemp scratched Lila's neck as he tightened it. The smell of the rope was dusty and old. Lila looked out at the sea of hatred. She felt small. She felt alone. Then she looked up. On the flat roof of the mercantile building across the square, a silhouette stood against the rising sun. It was Kai. He did not shout. He did not wave a weapon. He simply stood there, his feet planted wide, his rifle held across his chest. He was looking directly at her. His gaze was steady, anchoring her in the chaos. It was a look that said, "I see you. You are real. Stand firm." A few people in the crowd noticed him. Fingers pointed. "Apache!" someone yelled. "On the roof!" Panic rippled through the mob. But before a single gun could be raised, a gunshot rang out not from the roof, but from the street level. It was a warning shot, fired into the air. Deputy Noah Pike stood on the hood of a wagon, a piece of paper in his hand. "Stop!" Pike bellowed, his voice cracking but loud. "This is not justice. This is murder." "Get down, boy!" Crow shouted, his face turning a mottled purple. "You are drunk." "I am not drunk," Pike yelled. "I have the evidence. I have the telegraph log." He waved the paper Lila had given him. "This message was sent from the sheriff's office to Tucson 3 days ago. It orders the robbery, it says. Make it look like Redskins. It is signed by Silas Crow." The crowd wavered. The momentum of the hanging stalled. "He is lying," Crow roared, pulling a derringer from his vest. "He is working with the witch. Shoot him." "I saw her." A voice cut through the tension. It was a woman's voice, sharp and undeniable. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, a woman known for her piety and her lack of imagination, stepped out from the crowd. She pointed a flour-dusted finger at Sadie. "I saw Sadie Cale coming out of the bank's rear warehouse the night of the robbery." "Mrs. Gable announced. "I was checking my yeast barrels in the alley. She was carrying a heavy sack, and she met with Sheriff Dodd. I thought nothing of it until now." Sadie's face drained of all color. She stepped back, bumping into Crow. "Shut up, you old hag!" Crow screamed. The mask of the benevolent businessman shattered completely. "Kill them! Kill them all!" He raised his gun and fired at Pike. The bullet struck the wagon frame, sending splinters flying. Chaos erupted. The mercenaries, the men dressed as hunters who had been loitering in the crowd, drew their weapons. They were Crow's private army, and they opened fire on the few citizens who dared to look confused. But from the rooftops, the wind answered. Kai moved. He did not fire into the mass of people. He was a surgeon with a rifle. His first shot struck the pistol in Crow's hand, sending it spinning into the dirt. His second shot hit the shoulder of a mercenary, aiming at Mrs. Gable, spinning the man around. Arrows began to fall not from the sky, but from the alleys where Kai's few kinsmen had positioned themselves. They did not aim to kill. They pinned sleeves to wooden posts. They struck gun belts, severing the leather. It was a display of precision that turned the mercenaries' aggression into panic. On the platform, Dodd released Lila to reach for his holster. Lila did not wait for a hero. She was the hero of her own story. She drove her elbow back into Dodd's stomach, doubling him over. She tore the noose from her neck and grabbed the heavy brass bell that was used to signal the start of auctions. She swung it with both hands. Clang! The sound rang out over the gunshots, jarring and loud. Lila climbed onto the railing of the platform, making herself a target, making herself seen. "Listen to me," she screamed, her voice raw. "Look at the well." She pointed to the boarded-up well in the center of the square. "Crow bought the land south of here for pennies last week," Lila shouted, reciting the numbers she had memorized from the ledger. "He sold the water rights to the railroad for $4,000. He poisoned your well to make you thirsty enough to sell. He is not saving you. He is harvesting you." The fighting in the square slowed. The truth, spoken with the precision of an accountant and the passion of a woman wronged, cut deeper than a bullet. The miners looked at Crow, who was clutching his shattered hand. They looked at the mercenaries, who were now retreating under the suppressing fire from the rooftops. Sadie Cale saw the tide turn. She saw the eyes of the women in the town, the same women she had manipulated, turn toward her with dawning horror. She scrambled toward Crow, grabbing his coat. Silas, you promised you said we would own the town. Get us out of here. Crow, bleeding and furious, shoved her away with his good hand. Get off me, you stupid girl. You ruined everything. Sadie fell hard onto the rough planks. She looked up at Crow, then at the crowd, then at Lila. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was not a partner. She was a tool, and tools were discarded when they broke. He made me do it, Sadie shrieked, her voice shrill with hysteria. He told me he would burn the boarding house if I did not plant the key. Sheriff Dodd gave me the ore dust. It was them. It was all them. Sheriff Dodd, who had been trying to sneak down the back stairs, froze as 20 guns turned in his direction. Sadie, shut your mouth, Dodd hissed. It is over, Ephraim, Lila said, standing tall on the platform. The rope lay at her feet like a dead snake. The ledger does not lie. Crow, realizing his empire of dust had collapsed, made a desperate move. He lunged for a horse near the stage, intending to trample his way out. But a figure dropped from the roof of the stable, landing softly in the dust between Crow and freedom. It was Kai. He stood up, towering over the wounded cattle baron. He did not raise his rifle. He simply looked at Crow. The steady gaze that had comforted Lila now fell on Crow with the weight of a mountain. It was a look of absolute judgment. Crow faltered. The horse reared, sensing the tension. Move, Indian! Crow spat, though his voice wavered. The water belongs to the earth, Kai said, his voice calm enough to be heard across the silent square. You cannot sell what breathes. Crow fumbled for a knife in his boot. A shot rang out. Crow's hat flew off his head. At the far end of the street, a group of riders appeared. The lead man wore a badge that caught the sun. It was the U.S. Marshal from Tucson. Drop it, Crow, the marshal shouted. We met a young deputy on the road. Seems he had a lot of interesting things to say about silver shipments and telegraph codes. Crow's shoulders slumped. He dropped the knife. The townspeople stood frozen. The anger that had been directed at Lila now hung in the air, seeking a new target, but finding only shame. They looked at the rope. They looked at Lila, standing with her bruised neck and torn dress. And they looked at the Apache warrior standing guard between them and the corrupt men they had trusted. Lila walked down the stairs. She did not run to Kai. She walked to him. The crowd parted for her. Their eyes lowered. She stopped in front of him. The dust of the fight swirled around them. You came, she said softly. I said I would stand. Kai replied. He looked at the red mark on her neck, and for a second, his calm mask cracked, revealing a flash of fierce, protective anger. He reached out, his fingers hovering near the bruise but not touching it, as if afraid he might hurt her further. It is over, Lila said. The fighting is over, Kai corrected. The healing is harder. Sadie was being led away by the marshal's men, weeping loudly, begging for mercy from a town she had tried to sell. Dodd was in handcuffs. His head hung low. Lila looked at Sadie, feeling a pang of old friendship that tasted like ash. There was no victory in this, only survival. She turned back to Kai, in the middle of the town that had tried to kill her, under the gaze of the people who had hated her. She reached out and took his hand. I am not going anywhere. Kai, she said. Kai squeezed her hand. His steady gaze swept the crowd, challenging anyone to object. No one did. Then neither am I, he said. The sun finally cleared the horizon, burning away the red dawn and bathing the town in the harsh, revealing light of the morning. The rope swung empty in the breeze, a monument to a tragedy narrowly averted by the courage of a woman and the loyalty of a stranger. The dust in Red Creek did not settle all at once. It hung in the air for hours after the shouting stopped, a fine, copper-colored mist that tasted of gunpowder and shame. The town square, so recently a theater of violence, was now quiet. The gallows stood empty. The rope coiled on the platform like a sleeping snake that had been denied its meal. But the silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with the shuffling feet of men and women who could not look one another in the eye. Sheriff Ephraim Dodd sat on the edge of the watering trough, his hands manacled behind his back. He looked smaller without his badge, his chest deflated, his eyes darting nervously toward the marshal's deputies who stood guard. Beside him, Silas Crow sat on the ground, his fine suit ruined by the dirt, his hand wrapped in a bloody bandage. Even in chains, Crow held his chin up, his eyes burning with a cold, aristocratic fury, as if he could not quite believe that the world had dared to hold him accountable. Lila Garner stood near the telegraph office, watching them. She felt a strange hollowness in her chest. There was no surge of triumph, no sweet taste of victory. There was only exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that made her knees tremble. "They will be taken to Tucson," the marshal said, stepping up beside her. He was a gray-haired man with a mustache that hid his mouth, his voice gravelly from years of breathing desert sand. "Judge Parker does not look kindly on men who poison wells and incite riots." "And Sadie?" Lila asked. Her voice felt fragile, like dry leaves. "She goes with them," the marshal said. "Accessory to robbery, perjury, attempted murder." Lila looked toward the wagon where Sadie Cale was being held. Sadie was not crying anymore. She sat huddled in the corner of the wagon bed, her face pale and streaked with dirt. She looked young, terribly young, and broken. Lila walked over to the wagon. She did not know why. Perhaps she needed to see the end of the thread that had bound them together since that starving winter 5 years ago. Sadie looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but the hardness was gone, replaced by a terrified vacancy. "Lila," Sadie whispered, I did not think they would actually hang you. Crow said he would stop it at the last minute. He said he just needed to scare them." "You are lying to yourself." "Sadie," Lila said softly. "You knew. You watched them build the platform." "I wanted to go home," Sadie said, her voice cracking. "I just wanted a house with a floor that wasn't dirt. I was so tired of being hungry. Lila, you understand that, don't you? We were always so hungry." Lila looked at the woman who had once shared a single blanket with her to keep from freezing. She remembered the Sadie who had laughed when they had nothing, but that Sadie was gone, consumed by the Red Creek heat and the rot of greed. "I understand hunger," Lila said, her voice steady. "But I never ate my friends to fill my belly." Sadie flinched as if struck. She reached a hand out, fingers trembling. "Lila, please, tell them I was scared. Tell them Crow forced me. They will listen to you now." Lila stepped back, out of reach. "I will tell the truth. Sadie, that is all I have left, and that is all you have left." The deputies climbed onto the wagon seat. The whip cracked. As the wagon lurched forward, beginning the long journey to the territorial prison, Sadie did not scream. She just slumped against the wooden slats, watching Lila get smaller and smaller, until the dust swallowed her up. Lila turned back to the town. The sun was high now, beating down with its usual indifference. The people of Red Creek were beginning to move again. The paralysis of the morning was wearing off, replaced by an awkward, stuttering attempt at normalcy. A few men were dismantling the gallows, working with a frantic energy, as if removing the wood would remove the memory of what they had almost done. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife who had provided the crucial testimony, walked past Lila. She paused, adjusting her bonnet, her face flushing a deep pink. I will have fresh bread tomorrow," Mrs. Gable said, addressing the air somewhere over Lila's left shoulder. If you find yourself hungry. Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Lila said. "Mrs." Gable nodded jerkily and hurried away. It was a start. It was not an apology. Not really. It was a transaction. "I saved your life. You accept my bread, and we pretend I did not call you a harlot yesterday." Others were less gracious. As Lila walked down the boardwalk, the owner of the general store suddenly found a very interesting spot on his window that needed cleaning, turning his back to her. 2 women crossed the street, lifting their skirts to avoid the dust, their eyes fixed firmly on the horizon. They were ashamed, and shame. Lila knew. often looked a lot like anger. They hated her not because she was guilty, but because her innocence proved how easily they had been made into fools. She felt a presence at her side. She did not need to look to know who it was. The air seemed to settle around him, the chaotic noise of the street dampening. Kai walked with her. He did not walk behind her like a servant, nor in front of her like a protector. He walked beside her, his stride matching hers. He still carried his rifle, but it was slung over his shoulder now. The reaction of the town to Kai was different. It was not shame. It was fear. The men who had been brave enough to shout insults at a handcuffed woman now gave the Apache warrior a wide berth. They looked at his dark skin, his calm face, and the weapon on his back, and they saw a predator they had poked with a stick. They do not know where to look, Kai observed quietly. If they look at you, they see their sin. If they look at me, they see their fear. They will not forgive us for being right, Lila said. Not for a long time. Forgiveness is a luxury, Kai said. Survival is a duty. They reached the telegraph office. The door was still hanging off one hinge from the sheriff's kick the night before. Inside, the floor was littered with shattered glass and papers. Lila stepped inside. This was her domain. This was the place of logic, of codes, of clear signals sent through the wire. It was a mess, but it was a mess she could fix. You should go, Lila said, turning to Kai. The soldiers will be coming to escort the prisoners. If they see you... The soldiers know who stopped the shooting. Kai said, The marshal has sent word. That does not mean you are safe, Lila insisted. You are still Apache in a white man's territory. Every time you walk down this street, you are a target. Kai looked at her. He leaned against the door frame, blocking the harsh sunlight. I have been a target since the day I was born. It is better to be a target in the open than a ghost in the rocks. He looked around the wrecked office. You stay? It was the question that had been gnawing at Lila's mind. She could leave. She could get on the next stagecoach, go to San Francisco or Denver, find a job in a quiet bank where no one knew her name. She could disappear. But then she looked at the telegraph key on the desk. It was bent slightly, but intact. She looked at the logbook where she had found the truth. I ran away from my last home because I was sad, Lila said, picking up the heavy brass key. If I run away from this one, I will be running because I am afraid. I am tired of running. Kai, she set the key down. Besides, someone has to make sure the numbers add up in this town, or they will sell their souls for a bucket of water again. Kai's mouth quirked in that barely there smile. Then we work. He did not offer to do the technical work. He knew that was her skill. Instead, he moved to the door. He lifted the heavy frame, aligning the hinges with a strength that seemed effortless. He found a hammer and nails on a shelf and began to repair the wood. Lila found a broom. She began to sweep. For the rest of the afternoon, the only sounds in the office were the rhythmic swish-swish of the broom and the steady thud-thud of the hammer. It was a domestic symphony, played out in the wreckage of a crime scene. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in soft shades of lavender and gold, a strange sound drifted through the open door. It was the sound of a pump handle squeaking, followed by the splash of water. Lila went to the window. At the end of the street, the town blacksmith and 2 miners were at the main well. They had pried the boards off. They were pumping water into buckets. A line of people had formed, women with pitchers, children with cups, men with hats in their hands. It wasn't a celebration. It was quiet. People drank greedily, the water running down their chins, washing away the red dust. One of the miners, a burly man who had thrown a rock at Lila just 24 hours ago, saw Kai standing in the doorway of the telegraph office. The miner hesitated. He held a bucket of water. He looked at the well, then at Kai, then at the bucket. He walked over. He did not say a word. He set the full bucket down on the boardwalk in front of Kai. Then he turned and walked back to the line. Kai looked at the water. He did not drink. He nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin, acknowledging the debt paid. They are learning, Lila said softly. Slowly, Kai said, like a mule pulling a cart with square wheels. In the days that followed, Red Creek began to stitch itself back together. It was an uneasy healing. The void left by Crow was massive. He had owned half the businesses and all the debt. The town council held emergency meetings. There was talk of a co-op for the water rights, an idea proposed by the schoolteacher and championed, surprisingly, by the blacksmith. Lila was busy. The telegraph lines hummed with news of the trial, with orders for new mining equipment, with messages from families reassuring kin that they were safe. She worked 12 hours a day. Kai did not stay in the town. He camped on the ridge just outside the limits, close enough to see the lights, far enough to be free, but every day, at noon, he would walk into town. He never stayed long. He would bring her something, a rabbit he had snared, a handful of late-blooming desert flowers, or simply his presence. He would stand by the window while she worked, watching the street, his steady gaze acting as a shield against the lingering hostility of the town. One afternoon, a week after the arrest, Lila took a break. She walked behind the small schoolhouse where the children were playing during a recess. The drought had broken 2 days prior with a thunderous storm, and the world was greening with impossible speed. She sat on a bench, watching the children chase a hoop. Kai appeared from the shadow of the oak tree. He did not startle her anymore. She felt his presence before she saw him, a warmth that settled along her spine. "The little ones are loud," Kai noted, watching a boy scream with delight as he tackled his friend. "They are happy," Lila said. "They forget quickly. Children are like the grass," Kai said. "Trample them, and they spring back up when the rain comes. Men are like the mesquite tree. We grow hard and twisted, and we break before we bend." Lila looked at him. He was wearing a new shirt, one she had bought from the mercantile and left on the ridge for him. It was blue, the color of the sky after rain. "And you, Kai," she asked, "are you grass or mesquite?" He turned to her. The sunlight caught the sharp angles of his face. "I am the rock," he said simply. "The rock stays." A little girl, no older than 6, wandered over to them. She had been one of the children shouting "thief" because her mother had told her to. "Now," she looked at Kai with wide, curious eyes. She held out a small, smooth stone she had found. "For you," the girl said. Kai crouched down. He was tall and terrifying to the men of the town, but to the child, he was just interesting. He took the stone with a solemn gravity. He turned it over in his long fingers. "It is a good stone," Kai told her. "It has the river inside it." The girl giggled and ran back to her friends. Lila felt a lump in her throat. "You could have a life here, Kai, a real life, not just watching from the ridge." "This is not my world, Lila," Kai said, standing up. "I walk in it because you are here, but I cannot live in a box made of wood. My roof is the sky." "And what if I want the sky too?" Lila asked. Kai looked at her, his gaze intense. "The sky is cold at night, and it is lonely." "I have been lonely in a crowded room," Lila said. "I am not afraid of the dark." Their hands brushed. It was not a grasp, just a touch, electric and promising. They stood there in the schoolyard, a white woman and an Apache warrior, separated by culture and history, but bound by the truth they had forged in the fire. "Miss Garner." The shout broke the moment. It was Deputy Pike, now acting Sheriff Pike. He was jogging toward them, waving a telegram. "Message from Tucson," Pike said, stopping to catch his breath. He nodded respectfully to Kai, a habit he had developed quickly. "It is from the marshal." Lila took the yellow paper. She read the printed words, her heart sinking. "Crow trial set for next month. Testimony of Lila Garner required. State will provide transport and lodging in Tucson. Permanent position at Tucson Bank available upon conclusion. Safety guaranteed. It was the golden ticket. A way out. A job in a city with paved streets, ice cream parlors, and opera houses. A place where no one knew she had been almost hanged. A place where she could be a respectable widow again. "It is a good offer," Pike said eagerly. "The best. You could leave all this dust behind. Lila looked at the paper. Then she looked at the town, the patched-up buildings, the well that was working again, the telegraph office she had swept clean. Then she looked at Kai. He was watching her. He knew what the paper said. He could read the longing for safety in the lines of her face. He did not speak. He did not plead. He simply waited, his gaze steady, giving her the space to choose. If she went to Tucson, she would be safe. She would be comfortable, but she would be alone. Kai could not follow her to Tucson. The city would kill him, or he would wither in its stone canyons. If she stayed, she faced the whispers, the side glances, the heat, and the hard work. She faced a life with a man the world said she should hate. "Tell the marshal I will come for the trial," Lila said to Pike. "And the job?" Pike asked. "Shall I tell them you accept?" Lila folded the paper slowly. She ran her thumb over the crease. She looked at the red dust covering her boots. She looked at Kai, who stood as still as the earth itself. "Tell them," Lila said, her voice clear and strong, "that I already have a job, and I am not done with it yet." Pike blinked, surprised, but then a slow grin spread across his face. "I will wire them back. Miss Garner, good day, good day. Kai." Pike walked away. Kai looked at Lila. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a deep, quiet recognition. "Tucson has ice," Kai said, "and soft beds. Red Creek has you," Lila replied. She took a step toward him. "And I find that I prefer the heat." Kai did not smile, but the lines around his eyes softened. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her jaw. "Then we stand," Kai said. "We stand," Lila echoed. Above them, a hawk circled in the thermal currents, screeching a cry that belonged to the wild. The town of Red Creek bustled on, imperfect, scarred, and dusty. But in the telegraph office, the machine began to click, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat sending a message to the world that Lila Garner was still here. The wheels of justice turned slowly in the Arizona territory, grinding with the heavy, metallic screech of a machine that had been rusted by years of neglect. But when they finally caught traction, they crushed everything in their path. 2 months after the attempted hanging in Red Creek, the circuit judge arrived from Tucson. He was a man with a face like a dried apple and a gavel that sounded like a gunshot. The trial was held in the saloon, as it was the only building large enough to hold the spectators, though the mirrors had been draped in black cloth to lend the proceedings a veneer of solemnity. Silas Crow sat in the defendant's chair, stripped of his fine suits and his arrogance. The testimony was damning. The ledger pages Lila had stolen, combined with the telegraph logs Deputy Noah Pike had preserved, painted a picture of corruption so absolute it left no room for doubt. Crow was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor at the territorial prison in Yuma, a place known as the hellhole of the West. His assets were seized and liquidated to repay the town for the poisoned water and the inflated land prices. Sadie Cale testified against him in a voice so quiet the jury had to lean forward to hear her. She was granted leniency for her cooperation, but the judge ordered her exiled from the territory. When she left Red Creek on the noon stagecoach, she carried a single carpet bag. Lila watched from the window of the telegraph office. She did not wave. There was no joy in seeing her former friend reduced to nothing, only a quiet closing of a door that had been left open too long. With Crow gone, the air in Red Creek seemed to change. The fear that had been manufactured to control the populace evaporated, leaving behind a town that was confused, embarrassed, and in desperate need of direction. Lila Garner did not leave. The job in Tucson was still open, a standing offer from the marshal, but she filed the telegram in the bottom drawer of her desk. She had found something in Red Creek that she had never found in the polite parlors of the East or the bustling cities of the coast. She was needed. She took over the management of the telegraph office permanently. Under her hands, the chaotic tangle of messages became a streamlined system. She knew who needed supplies, who was waiting for money, and who just needed to hear a kind word from a distant relative. But her work did not end when the wire went silent for the night. 3 evenings a week, she opened the doors of the small office to the children of the miners. These were children who had known only red dust and the dark mouths of the mines. Lila taught them to read. She taught them that the marks on a page were not secrets kept by the rich, but keys that could open the world. A for apple, she would say, pointing to the slate. B for brave. C for crow, a boy once shouted, repeating what he had heard his father curse at the dinner table. No, Lila had corrected gently, her eyes finding the boy's dusty face. C is for courage, because it takes courage to build something new. Kai was not a fixture in the town in the way Lila was. He did not sit on the town council, nor did he drink in the saloon. He remained a man of the open spaces, a creature of the horizon. He would disappear for days at a time, guiding survey parties through the treacherous passes or tracking lost livestock for the ranchers who had once cursed his name. But he always came back. To the people of Red Creek, his return became a rhythm they grew to rely on, like the rising of the sun. When they saw the tall, silent figure walking down the main street, his rifle slung over his shoulder and his stride eating up the ground, they felt a strange sense of security. He was no longer the boogeyman in the dark. He was the wolf that guarded the door. For Lila, his returns were the anchor of her life. She did not try to tame him. She did not ask him to wear suits or sit in a pew on Sunday. She understood that to clip his wings would be to kill the very thing she loved. One afternoon in late October, the heat finally broke. The wind that swept down from the mesas was cool, carrying the scent of pine from the high country and the sweet, dry smell of sage. Lila closed the telegraph office early. She walked out to the edge of town, to a bluff that overlooked the valley. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in strokes of violent orange and soft purple. The red dust of the valley floor glowed as if it were lit from within. Kai was waiting for her. He stood near the edge of the cliff, looking out at the vast emptiness. He did not turn when she approached. He knew her step as well as he knew his own heartbeat. The wind is changing, Kai said. Winter will come early this year. Lila stood beside him, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. We have wood stored, and the roof of the office is fixed. You have prepared well, Kai said. He turned to look at her. The months had changed them both. Lila's skin was tanned by the sun, and there were fine lines around her eyes from squinting against the glare. She looked stronger, more solid, as if the iron of the earth had entered her blood. Kai looked less like a warrior at war and more like a man at peace. The tension that had held his shoulders high was gone. I received a message today, Lila said, watching a hawk circle below them. From the railroad. They want to know if I will sell the deed to the land Crow tried to steal. The town council voted to give it to me as payment for everything. It is good land, Kai said. It has water. It is worth a lot of money. Lila continued. Enough to go anywhere. Enough to buy a house in San Francisco with a view of the ocean. Kai was silent. He did not look at the ground. He looked at her. He waited. I told them no, Lila said. She turned to face him fully. I told them I intend to build on it. A house, not in the town, but near it. A place with a view of the mesas. Kai nodded slowly. A house needs a foundation. And a house needs walls, Lila said. She took a step closer to him. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she did not brush it away. But mostly, a house needs people who choose to be there. She looked up at him, her heart beating a steady, confident rhythm. I am not running anymore. Kai, I am not hiding behind a ledger, and I am not hiding from the world. I am standing here. Kai reached out and took her hands. His grip was warm and rough. He looked at her with that intense, unwavering focus, the steady gaze that had saved her life in the desert, the gaze that had silenced a mob. If you stand here, Kai said, his voice low and vibrating with the weight of a vow. I also stand. It was not a poem. It was not a flowery declaration of romance like the ones she had read in novels. It was a statement of fact. It was as undeniable as the rock beneath their feet. Lila squeezed his hands. I do not need anyone to save me. Kai, I proved that. I do not need a hero. She looked deep into his dark eyes, seeing her own reflection and the future stretching out before them. "I need a person to look at me like a human being," she whispered. "I need you." Kai looked at her, the steady gaze softening into something that looked like worship, and that was the simplest, most profound proposal she could have asked for. They did not go to the church. The god of Red Creek had been too often invoked to justify hate for them to feel comfortable at his altar just yet. Instead, 2 days later, they rode out to the hidden canyon where Kai had first taken her, the place of water and shade. It was a private ceremony, witnessed only by the old man who had translated for her and Ishta, Kai's sister. There was no white dress, no tuxedo. Lila wore her best blue calico, and Kai wore a clean buckskin shirt. They stood by the edge of the spring. The old man spoke in the Apache tongue, his voice blending with the sound of the water. He took a strip of red cloth, a piece of the very earth. It seemed, and bound their right hands together. "Bind to the sky," the old man translated, pointing up. "Bind to the earth." He pointed down. "Bind to the water." Kai looked at Lila. "I promise to walk where you walk," he said in English. "I promise to share my fire and my silence." Lila swallowed the lump in her throat. "I promise to hold the line," she said. "I promise that you will never have to be a ghost in your own home." They drank from the spring, the water cool and sweet. It was a baptism of sorts, washing away the labels of widow and savage, leaving only husband and wife. When they returned to Red Creek, there was no parade. The town did not suddenly transform into a utopia of racial harmony. As they walked down the street hand in hand, Lila saw Mrs. Gable peek through her curtains and quickly close them. She heard the whispers of the men outside the barber shop. There were still those who believed that a white woman marrying an Apache was a sin against nature. But things had changed. Later that week, late at night, a frantic knocking came at the door of the small cabin Lila and Kai had temporarily rented at the edge of town. Lila opened the door to find the blacksmith, a man as big as a mountain, holding his young daughter in his arms. The girl was burning with fever, her face flushed and dry. "Dr. Miller is drunk," the blacksmith gasped, panic in his eyes. "He cannot stand up. My girl, she is burning up. Lila, I do not know what to do." He looked past Lila, into the shadows of the room where Kai sat cleaning his rifle. The blacksmith swallowed hard. Does he know the fever root?" the blacksmith asked, his voice humble. "I heard the Apache know the fever root." Kai stood up. He did not gloat. He did not demand an apology for the rocks thrown or the names called. He simply set his rifle down and picked up his medicine pouch. "I know it," Kai said. "Bring her in." Lila boiled the water, and Kai mixed the herbs. They worked together through the long night, cooling the child's forehead, administering the medicine drop by drop. The blacksmith sat in the corner, twisting his hat, watching the savage save his world. By dawn, the fever broke. The girl slept peacefully. The blacksmith stood at the door, tears in his eyes. He tried to offer money, but Kai shook his head. "Water is free," Kai said. "Life is free." The blacksmith nodded, unable to speak. He shook Kai's hand, a firm, man-to-man grip, and carried his daughter home. This was their life. It was not easy. There were still days when the wind blew too hard, when the dust got into everything, when the prejudice of the world felt like a wall they could not climb. But they were no longer fighting it alone. Lila continued to run the telegraph, the heartbeat of the town. She ensured that the truth traveled through the wires, that no more secret orders for violence could be sent without challenge. Kai continued to walk the edges, the guardian of the boundaries, the bridge between the town and the wild that surrounded it. The story of Red Creek was no longer a story of betrayal. It was a story of endurance. In the final days of the year 1887, Lila and Kai stood on the porch of the house they were building. It was a frame of sturdy timber, rising from the red earth. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. The dust was still there, swirling in the golden light. The west was still wild, still dangerous, still unforgiving. But Lila was not looking at the horizon with fear. She looked at the man standing next to her. Kai rested his hand on the railing, his eyes scanning the distance with that familiar, steady gaze. But then he turned to her. His eyes softened, the vigilance replaced by a profound peace. "It is a good view," Kai said. "It is our view," Lila replied. She leaned her head against his shoulder. They stood there as the stars began to come out. Two people who had been broken by the world and had used the pieces to build something stronger. They had not been saved by a miracle. They had been saved by the simple, radical act of seeing the truth in one another. The bad men had used fear to divide, to isolate, to conquer. But Lila and Kai had used truth and courage to rebuild. They had proven that love did not make a person soft. It stripped away the armor of cynicism and the shield of prejudice. It made them real. And in the silence of the desert, standing together against the encroaching night, they were the most real things for 1,000 miles. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Lila and Kai as much as I enjoyed writing it. It is a story about finding strength in the most unlikely places and the power of standing your ground when the world tries to knock you down. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment down below and tell me where you are listening from. Are you in the bustling city, the quiet countryside, or somewhere in between? Let's share our stories and connect. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Hit that like button if you want to see more stories like this. And if you really want to support the channel and help these stories reach more people, please smash that hype button. Your support means the world to me and helps keep the spirit of the Wild West alive. Until next time, keep your gaze steady and your heart true.